Hello, world of YouTube, and welcome to the listening log update for December of 2025. There's technically 22, but 21 segments of records listed out in the description. Click around, see what you like, dive into things you don't know. See, maybe you'll find something you like. It's a long video. There's a lot to pull together. And I've got list week right around the corner, so we're going to keep the gravy train rolling. Give it a like if you're excited, and let's go.
For the whiz, the other day she tried to drive the car right off the bridge. I was high out. You know the speed since the leaves were striped. I'm just a big.
I found a review of this Mathematics Wu-Tang collab, and it is a project that is very meddling in hindsight, but the more that I think about it, the more that I feel like it is sort of like this anomalous, half-assed approach to a prospect like this. Mathematics and Wu-Tang have done a decent amount together, but I stopped spinning this when the Ghostface Raekwon albums dropped, and I never really picked it back up. It's a project that I feel like had this idea of presenting the barest minimum of effort at sort of using the Wu-Tang pastiche in a different, if not wholly familiar fashion. And I feel like, yeah, outside of a couple choice verses, I'm looking at you, Jizza, in particular, while also wholly underutilized. His verses is out there in its own regards, and maybe that's a reason why he doesn't write many verses much for these guys. But, like, outside of Mandingo, even if Raekwon's verse sounds like it was recorded from a voice note that he recorded, like, on tour, or hearing the RZA So Electrified on Roar of the Lion, and on Let's Do It Again. It's also cool to hear Benny the Butcher and Method Man really come together on Warriors Too Coolly High. A lot of this album feels very half-baked. In a similar way that I feel like the Supreme Clientele sequel that came out after this did, but the real lack of focus on using Wu-Tang members properly, or like having a vision with the guys on a project like this, is where this album I feel like ultimately fails. I mean, by the end of the album, it really just kind of feels like various artists coming in to try and just hop in on this style and do their own thing without really fitting the vibe, so to speak, or even just sort of like detracting from the vision, so to speak, of this Mathematics Wu-Tang culmination. It's a record that it won't rank amongst my worst as far as like the tippy top, but I would say this is a record that I put down for a reason and had no desire to even spin its highlights, because better things were done by a lot of the artists at hand in a year that was so stacked in hip-hop, like many years in recent have been. But this feels like the worst kind of commodifying, and in a year where like even parts of the scene were like bringing legends back and looking back on the successes and legacy in hip-hop. This does not do the same with the same type of respect that like I feel like it's trying to in the moments where it's trying to get nostalgic. I'm giving this a 4 out of 10. It's definitely not great, but it's not something that I would say is maybe the worst thing attached to a Wu-Tang member, nor is it the worst thing attached to the brand. It's just a bad slice of what has been a long-standing legacy.
See no reason really for us to, wallow in any sort of fear.
While I've missed Saul Williams doing traditional albums, one album I did keep on rotation when it came out, and parts of it I would throw on just to like feel the vibe out still, because I knew I was going to talk about it at some point, was the collab he did with Carlos Niño. Saul Williams meets Carlos Niño and friends at Treepeople jazz record. It shows Saul Williams really showcasing his poetic side of his writing and his love of free verse and less rigid structure writing, to make a very stark juxtaposition to some of the ambient jazz that Carlos Niño is pulling together. Carlos Niño, by the way, just seemingly on a really wild circuit of working with some of my favorite artists, but I like that a big portion of this is Saul just sort of, I don't want to say playing his hits, but very much just further pushing the way he sees the world in vivid, abstract detail. I really love the rapid-fire beginnings of We Are Calling Out in This Moment. It feels like a good sort of actual warm-up after Saul and Carlos sort of like just trade the space on Sound and Words and We Lift Our Voice. You know, We Lift Our Voice has a moment where a lot more arrangement sort of comes into the fray and adds life to what's been it sort of helps build this world with Saul. And I really enjoy where they decide to really break things down on a systemic level on here. And I dig it. I dig this. You know, you'll hear me talk about, ironically enough, spoken word a couple times this month, which is really fun. But I love how Saul's style doesn't feel like it's aged a day. It still feels as sharp as ever. I think it's interesting that they even keep his speech he kind of delivers after the concert's over, and it just kind of is a little more frank about wanting change and like speaking about problems that have been cropping up across the world. Something that he does a lot, and I really love hearing him speak on the world issues. I think he has a very commanding voice. He has a voice that I think is just very iconic, and he's just very good at speaking. And I like that they kept that in, because I think that it's important to show that he's a great writer, but he's also just a good speaker. I like this. It's not a record that I spun in full that often, because it is much more on the abstract side of Saul's artistic interests. But I do still really enjoy this in the same way that I do enjoy his more rigidly constructed, I guess, records like Martyr, Loser, King, and the like. But this is great. I'm giving this like a 7 out of 10. I would love to see Saul do more like this, as much as I, again, miss his more structured stuff from time to time. I've got a whole discography of that I can spin, and I like seeing him go the distance artistically, and I think that this is a cool vibe. It's chill, while also being the same kind of militant, like, intense that Saul can deliver from time to time on the mic. One game you guys will hear me talk about next week, and I still kind of can't stop thinking about to some degree, partially due to its music, is one Skate Story. And while I don't talk about game soundtracks or movie soundtracks as much on the listening logs, they are something I do pay attention to, and especially the games that I play. But I feel like in the case of Skate Story, its 2-volume soundtrack by John Fio and Blood Cultures work as records because they're vibes, even if they are also like pieces of a visual medium. They're more traditional music based than they are just strictly like soundtrack stylings. Especially if I'm going to talk about the fucking Tron Ares soundtrack with how that is approached and stuff, and I'm a big believer in soundtracks are still music. I feel like if I'm going to approach it, if I'm going to introduce that as a concept to people or further push that idea with people, these 2 records are good examples of that. Volume 1 by Blood Cultures is a little bit more of like an album-ass album, whereas Volume 2 has a sonic spirit that also fits in the vibe of Volume 1, even if it's a different artist, but the approach is different, considering, I'm guessing, which is John Fio's more musical artistry is. But both work well to accent the wild visual artistry and concepts explored in Skate Story through the likes of bold synths with Blood Cultures, a lot of dance energy permeating throughout some chill wave inspired stuff in the same breath. You know, the piano tones and the synth tones on tracks like the opener, Collapsing Like Clouds into Smoke, or on Into Pure Momentum, lend to this just dreamlike atmosphere. I love that they pair those with the like some of the boss battle tracks in the game, but It's Hostile, or on the Unarchiver, which is straight up just a song that I feel like would go off in a club. The energy of that song is fantastic, and the beat and groove of that is just immaculately produced. The Alpha, the Omega could very much fit in the same camp of like what a lot of synth pop bands were doing in like the late 2010s, early 2020s. And I like that John Fio's version introduces ideas of like what more fits within the worlds of like a skateboarding game, with like Red Void having almost like a Midwest emo guitar-led dreariness that I think helps keep the mood of the game intact, but very much puts it in a different reality. The same, I think, could be said with the two-tone inspired Midferno, a song with a really great brass lead that I think more fits in the landscapes of like painting a type of hell, and I think lends to that painting in a way that feels very evocative of some like traditional or adjacent images of hell, or pseudo-contemporary visions of hell. But like the guitar work on the John Fio stuff just helps ground the album as a whole in a different type of reality that pairs with the Blood Culture stuff wonderfully. Because the Gift Shop song is also just a really nice sort of like jangle pop adjacent jam that I think still fits within the sonic tapestry of this, but also has its own little pocket. I like these soundtracks. I think they're both very great. I think on their own, they're both still 8 out of 10 records. They're 8 out of 10s as a collaborative piece, as a piece of something. I think that if you want to see an example of how one could view soundtracks as albums themselves, this is a great example of that. And they're great albums too, on top of soundtrack pieces of something else. One band whose debut I covered on the listening log that I really wanted to keep following post that debut, especially considering it still has some songs that I think stick out and I enjoy as far as like shoegaze-inspired rock goes, and it's Irish trio Newdad, and they just dropped their new album Alter a couple months ago, and I kept wanting to spin it as the fall months went on, and it very much evokes that vibe, but it just kept falling off my radar. But I did finally spit in some time with it in December, and I really enjoy it. I think it's a step up from their debut in Sonics, but I feel like they could still do something bigger that I think would really pack a deeper punch. But there's some really great strengths on this album, and I think the Sonics on this album are very much an interesting sort of improving on, but also like retooling. They really sort of like take their shoegaze worship and put it in some interesting avenues. You know, it obviously has some real weight to it. The sort of nosedive that happens on the drop of the first song, Other Side, is a really big moment that I think nails, you know, it lands perfectly. I think that like Heavyweight after that keeps that sort of stage set too, and it's a really strong song. I think it's really nice and catchy and shows their strengths as a nice catchy rock band, but also like the bass production that really emanates throughout the record keeps that weight just beneath the listener's feet the entire time. You know, I love the stretch through Rubash. That bass production on there, that groove is strong as hell. Another really catchy song that I absolutely love is Everything I Wanted. I think it's got this really nice flourishing out that I think is catchy and anthemic, and also very emotional. There's a weight to it that I think is great, and I think it captures the feeling of like lost in some noise fantastically, talking about being lost in the city, you know, trying to keep oneself busy. I like that the band is really trying to work on a sort of like album style experience. You know, I do enjoy the other moments of like ambience and the sort of way that it adds to the sonic tapestry, you know, like Vertigo or Sinking Kind of Feeling, which help sort of carry the listener through very like key points in the pacing of the record, so to speak. I genuinely think that this is like a really nice step up for these guys. I like seeing where they take their sounds. I think that if you like shoegaze-inspired rock music and you enjoy bands that really know how to balance a good bass groove with that guitar worship, this is a great band to do so. I give this album like a 7 or an 8 out of 10. I think this album is choice. It's an album that I've loved spinning during this time of the year. I think I would have enjoyed it more as I was walking on my morning walks when the air was starting to get brisk. It very much is that kind of record, and I'm glad that these guys are really honing in their sound in ways that I think works. I still think that they could really they could go the distance if they tried, and I would love to see these guys continue to just pillage on this path. But choice follow-up. I really enjoy this record a lot. One of the plethora of albums I listened to this month purely to check out parts of hype from 2025 that I knew I missed. Through the Wall by Rochelle Jordan, though, has been easily the record that's probably gotten the most love from me in December, though. I love the balance of R&B and worship to an era of dance music that I just cannot get enough of. The electronic spirit of this and embracing of stuff like house, I just think sounds so fucking slick and blends well with her voice and delivery, and I think that her pairing of that with this relationship coursing throughout the lyrics, I think creates a pairing that I think works so beautifully. I love the driving hooks on this, but I love how they are more inspired by electronic music and having great lines just tie the themes together. Absolutely love this album. I think that it is a smash that I absolutely get why it is catching on like fire throughout circuits of the blogosphere. Those iconic synth sounds on tracks like La Di Da, doing it to really just so much of this just evokes a feel and an era of electronic music that I know a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for, but I very much share that same love and love and adoration for. But they create atmospheres in some of these songs that very much still tie to that passion and that romance. And I think Rochelle just sells it all. I think this album is absolutely a bona fide splash. I think the drops equally add to that emotional accenting that I think gives the listener that push and pull throughout the sensuality that I think has been really fun to respin. As somebody who loves himself some dance music, as shown by some of the playlists I've talked about making in the past, this is absolutely a record that I can just keep on rotation for the same reason as my love for some of those playlists. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Absolute splash, and absolutely think if you love dance music, you've got to listen to this album.
Since that night, I feel alive to close calls. I seen your dogs, heard them bark, but they done lost, so they snarl. Be weary of the...
One of my favorite songs by Sage Francis is Escape Artist. Is a song that equates his introduction and love of hip-hop to a magic show. And this McKinley Dixon album, Magic Alive, it talks about a different kind of magic, or talks about the magic of music in a different kind of fashion that I think helps tackle this story of grief in a way that I think is powerful and lively. And it's a record full of life, which, having these themes about death and grief and reflection, adds a really nice pairing that I think creates a very human-feeling record that I really, really love. There is an unbridled energy with the sonic identity of the jazz inspirations that linger throughout this album that I think give McKinley Dixon a hell of a backdrop to tell this interesting story of these three kids dealing with the death of their friend and how he evolves that into him waxing poetic on his life and the people around him and bridging the story and his life, so to speak. And I think creates for a really nice whirlwind of a record that was one of many this month that I checked out of curiosity of seeing what was catching waves in 2025. And I'm glad I did spin this. McKinley Dixon is also on a record that is going to be very high on my of the year list, the Cheekface album. And I liked his contributions on Military Gum. So his album was something that was on my radar throughout the year. I just hate that it took me till December to really give it some time, because it is easily a record that I understand why a lot of people are putting it highly on their best of the year and their best hip-hop records outside of the general populace of all music from the year. But this is very much a really nice achievement as a really concise project that has these allusions and talks about magic and the metaphor of what it could really be that I think come across the page still just as concise, just as clearly, even amidst that concise, lively chaos that is this album. I think a lot of the creative hands in the pot add a lot to that. You know, seeing artists like Qual Chris and Gaze Guevara on here made a lot of sense on the other side, and I love their contributions here, along with the reoccurrence of Teller Banks on the tracks that he's on. I think that the dramatics on a track like Recitafe through We're Outside Rejoice lend to the theatricality that the liveliness of the instrumentation also adds, that I think adds to the magic, so to speak, of this record and the story that's told throughout it. There is very much kind of like an abstract A to B storytelling approach to this that feels direct but still has its own looseness, so to speak. But I really like this record. I think that it is very much an electrifying listen that will end up high on my of the year list. I'm giving this a 9. This album is fan-fucking-tastic, and I'm absolutely buying into the hype. I think this record is great, well worth it if you love hip-hop. If you love jazz rap especially, I think it's a really good slice in that lane that I think shone bright for very good reason.
That's what's happening to me.
In the wake of the death of Randy Fitzsimmons and Jack White's No Name in particular, I didn't expect the Hives to come back with a record that necessarily sounded like the Hives Forever the Hives, but it's also a record that feels like the band trying to reinvent their wheel while skirting the lines of parody and pastiche. That feels very much in service of the band's tongue-in-cheek nature. I just kind of wish if they were going to commit to this more raw production, that they would go the full 9 with it. But instead, they try and strike this balance of having some raw, more, I don't want to say rugged, but jagged songs juxtaposed with these cleaner produced and more accessible sounding jams that create for an imbalance of a listen that feels like it's trying to put 2 feet in 2 different pools without going and wading fully in the waters of either. The record itself isn't wholly offensive or bad. I think it is a solid batch of songs from this band, but I think compared to the artistic through lines or lack thereof that are sprinkled throughout their records that I would say are better than this, while this record plays it very straight and narrow on the sonic front, it's the subtext and a lot of the beneath that where I have problems with it, even if they are few and far between. Because at the end of the day, this album is fine enough. It's solid. I think that Enough is Enough is the most on-the-nose sort of point of maybe where the creative process for this record maybe started, and from there it sort of evolved out. But tracks like It, OCDOD, and Legalized Living, and Born a Rebel all feel very in the spirit of this band's general MO, lyrically and sonically speaking. And again, when leaning into that, trying to create a non-pastiche reinventing of the wheel, those hit the nail on the head solidly, and the production on some of those jams have that rawness that I actually like more when compared to the cleaner sounding stuff. It is, at the end of the day, a rock album by the Hives that sounds like a rock album by the Hives that's trying to be a rock album by the Hives. It's trying to reinvent what a rock album by the Hives means. And if that word salad meant anything to you, you'll probably like the Hives Forever the Hives. And I like it too. Don't make no mistake to the things I want to point out as critiques, because again, It's all subtext. It's all beneath a lot of the mystique of what is a very straightforward rock album. And as far as a straightforward rock album goes, you could do worse than this, especially in recent years. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10 because it's really not bad. It's just relatively solid. I've had Eusexua on my radar since it released. You know, every time I've given FKA Twigs spins, I've enjoyed my time. I've never gotten into her records on release, but like there's songs of hers that I have on heavy rotation that just stay like in playlists and like just on deck. And I wanted to make Eusexua my like jumping on point, you know, to an artist that I've enjoyed some snippets that I've heard. Then that time came and went in January, and then the year kept happening. She dropped a sister record to this that I'll be talking about after this, that I thought was a really fun time to spin together, so I just decided to spin them at the same time in December catch-up. I do feel like a ripe jackass sleeping on this record all year, because it is great, but like, you know, what are you going to do? What I think is interesting about Eusexua, though, is its sound, because I think that, like, it does this, like, genre blend under the same umbrella art pop twist gracefully, and it's something that, like, I should have expected from her, given what I like about the music that I've listened to of hers, but I think that this does a good job at making a theme, keeping it sensual, keeping it sexual in a lot of ways, but having a production that, like, just amplifies all those feelings on 10 because it just sounds so clean. You feel like you're in the, like, well-controlled atmosphere that she's, like, wanting to bring together on these songs. There's, like, a real mantra into the welcoming of the title track that, like, I think welcomes the listener into this world that, like, keeps the listener lulled in the groove with Girl Feels Good. You know, I think that, like, the actual high-energy electronic inspiration shines just as brightly on here, but I think that, like, when she makes these, like, nuggets of just pop bliss, it just really carries the listener through this experience strongly. You know, the way that it transitions the listener into that, like, more out there ideas throughout Drums of Death into, like, some of the vocal work on Sticky and Keep It Hold It. You know, I love that, like, parts of this very much, like, feel locked in the pocket, but, like, have their flares of eccentricities. You know, I think that it's a really cool balance that she strikes on here. There's some points where I feel like it does sort of like stretch into realms that I don't like as much as other parts of the record. Like, admittedly, I'm not big on Sticky. I do think that like the vocal leads are nice, but I don't like the song as a whole. I also love the sonics of Striptease, but I don't really like the vocals on the song. And I don't really like 24 Hour Dog after that. That's just like a stretch of the record that I'm not as big on. But I feel like as a whole, the record doesn't feel set back entirely by it. I think Wanderlust is a really good closer for the record. And as a whole, I think this record is really good. I think if you like parts of where pop has been like dipping into electronic inspiration, you want something a little more experimental and with its edges, I think that this record has some fun ideas. I'll tell you which of the two I like more after I talk about the sister album, but I'm giving this an 8. I think that it is a strong album. I've been toying between a 7 or an 8, but like right now I'm at it with an 8. With time that could change, but I think that this is a solid album that has some really great moments within it, and a solid use of tone for its themes that I think she does do some fun stuff with amidst that on top of it.
Glory on my denim, this not a word where no pausing with this, I'm just trying to splurge here. Glory on my denim, this not a word where no pausing with this, I'm trying to splurge.
Now again, when Eusexua Afterglow dropped in November, I mean, I wasn't necessarily expecting it. I figured if I didn't spend Eusexua in November, I was going to do so in December in the grand catch-up. But like once Afterglow dropped, I was like, yeah, I'll just listen to them together now. And I don't necessarily think that time with Eusexua would have affected my enjoyment of this because of how different it is. It is very much not the same as like a lot of the remix albums that have been happening with a lot of pop records since, I guess, around Chromatica, but like that record is one that sticks in my mind that has a remix album that is a dance-inspired pop album. There's also the Brad album, Fancy Some More for Fancy That this year. But like Afterglow is just a record of a bunch of different songs that sort of take the vibe of Eusexua, the very clean but like tense and sensual vibes, and adding a lot of ethereal atmosphere to it and give this different experience that has some still tension throughout the energy, but also a lot of other emotions swirling around that I enjoy her sort of toying with. There's a lot of sort of like post-nut clarity, I feel like, that drives throughout Slushy into Wild and Alone, a really solid collab with Pink Pantheress, speaking of Fancy Some More, and Hard, whereas Cheap Hotel feels like it's trying to like stay sensual, almost like trying to like recapture that energy maybe, but like it's still in this hazy afterglow. I don't know. I dig the vibes of this. I think it's a really cool album. I love the production of this a lot. If you follow me on Instagram, I've been doing the genre, best by genre for albums in anticipation for List Week that's happening next week. As of posting this video, the electronic list, which is what this is on, and the rock list, which Eusexua isn't on, but it will be on one of the other lists. Just to give people intrigue into like what my top 50 might be looking at, like, for those that enjoy seeing what my top 50 favorite albums of the year are, mashed together with like the stuff that isn't electronic pop and rock, metal, and hip-hop. But I'm digressing because I'm detracting from the Afterglow review. This album is great and is on that electronic list. I think that a lot of the production feels more electronic inspired than some of the restraint that could have been seen within the more focus on some hook writing on Eusexua that I think puts this record in a realm where I like it more than Eusexua. Like, I really enjoy a lot of the hook work and a lot of the fun journey, like the journey that the album takes you on, but I love the vibes of this. I think that it does a good job at like creating this dichotomy of passion. You know, again, that initial stretch is great, but I love how the album takes that feeling, that inner post-nut clarity, and like morphing it throughout like some of the parts of Peace of Mind and Predictable Girls sort of energy. I dig this album a lot. It's also getting an 8, but it's like more like it's probably going to stay an 8. I dig the vibes of this a lot. I think that it's like a really cool idea for like a companion record, one based in like such a passion driven vibe, and taking it somewhere else. It's cool, and I'm glad that I decided to give FKA Twigs some time, because I think that these records are pretty good, and I want to listen to more of her older stuff. So I'm very familiar with very specific parts of Daniel Lopatin's work under Oneothrix Point Never. I was introduced to him through a remix of Find My Way, the Nine Inch Nails song. I'm sure I've talked about it. If I have, here's a clip. I didn't know he also produced stuff for The Weeknd, but I have enjoyed what bits of production he's done, and I think that considering the sounds of parts of Tranquilizer, I can feel parts of the throwback atmosphere of a record like Dawn FM permeating throughout some of the sonics on this. But I enjoy this album, Tranquilizer, at the very least. I haven't spun any of his other records, but he does have a discography under this moniker. I'll have to give it a listen, because I think that this record is pretty fucking choice. One record that it reminded me of in a quasi sort of way, not at all in the actual music, but the inspiration is very similar. Venetian Snares 2016 classic, traditional synthesizer music. That album was made with like all old school synths, and it's like a breakcore record, so it has like a modern vibe, even though it has very old sounds. The production on this is all pulled together from like a lost sample pack from the 90s that I guess was found on like Internet Archive. And Daniel was like, I could do something with that. And here we are, a record that has a very modern feel with the style of beats on here, but has a very vintage sound considering its source. And I think creates a really good cocktail that I enjoy a lot, honestly. The vibes on here in Choice, I wish I would have spun this in like the spring, summertime, because I could see this working its way into like some of my electronic playlists. I really dig the vibe and where he takes space on here. It is a very airy record. You know, it's introduced with this like ambience, and that air really much permeates throughout the beats, but like bumpy is a vibe. Life World feels like a fucking lobby in a lost Sega Saturn fucking RPG. There's a real ambience that kind of creeps out throughout tracks like Modern Lust and Cherry Blue and Storm Show that feel very evocative of some like sparse new age ideas, or at least new age roots, but that could also be again lended to the sonic source. I don't know. I do like the construction of this. I think that it's a really cool concept. It's a really neat approach, and I think that Daniel did a really good job at pulling together some songs that do have some choice beats to them, and they do kind of have like a groove, but I like that this album really sits in the ambience and let the listener kind of just enjoy these samples interpreted in a variety of different ways. And, you know, in some ways it also reminds me of what I love, ironically enough, from like indie game soundtracks like Fez. It very much evokes that same kind of like loose idea with like a sonic palette to unify it all. I don't know. I really enjoy this album. I think that it is, if you like electronic music, it's a cool excursion. I'd give this like an 8 out of 10. Really, really strong record from this year that I think is absolutely a vibe. Now, I have been one to use the December release to do some morbid diving into the realms of territories I know I'm not really going to enjoy spinning on the other side. But I only did that one time to myself, and it's because I'd already been exposed to a couple of the songs from this, because this artist is very high profile and a very big pop star right now. He just also happens to be a pop star who I don't really like the music for. It is Benson Boone for American Heart. While catching up on the charts like I did in November, I knew I was going to be doing this at some point, and I gotta say, on the other side, I really fucking hate this album. I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time talking about it here, because I'm gonna talk about it again next week, but yes, I am one of the many that do not like Benson Boone's brand of singing. I think that he picks production that very much matches his style, and I think that style of production very much, the ways that it pays homage to like 80s Heartland style through the lenses of like Mr. Electric Blue and I Want to Be the One You Call and Take Me Home and stuff like that, I think could work. But through the vacuum of production that backs this, I don't think does work. I think it pairs well with Benson's brand of singing, but I don't think it is a pairing that I enjoy. I think it is like almost pseudo-parody for how it sounds, and I don't think it really translates well for me. I just don't think this is my bag whatsoever. I think that it is infectious, it is catchy. I have had Mystical Magical stuck in my head when I was spinning this album, and I hated that every time that the chorus of it cropped into my head while doing any relative day-to-day task. But it is catchy. I'll give it that. I'm still giving it a 1. It is still hot garbo in my opinion, but it is catchy garbage, which I don't think is that a compliment in any sort of regard.
City, where we launch from, living in a skin, placed under the gun, but on a straight path, never a detour. Survive.
Out of all the records that Nas was like helping promote and announce of like bringing legends back for another late in their career run, I'm assuming sort of to show that he's not the only one that can do it, considering his 6-peat with Hit Boy. But out of all the ones that were announced, 2 I had a lot of curiosity about, and I only ended up getting to one by the end of the year, and that one was De La Soul's Cabin in the Sky. The other one was the Mobb Deep album, for those that want to know. But I love De La Soul. I really was shocked that this was announced, given David passed like a couple years ago at this point, and I didn't know what that kind of record was gonna feel like. But like, it's more in the spirit of a record that I'm sure a lot of people in the critical space have talked about in comparison points, but that Tribe album from 2016, Thank You For Your Service, an album that I absolutely love. Considering hearing that verses from Dave were on here, I very much kind of gave that kind of energy, but like, what I think is interesting about this record is that they use that spirit of celebrating life, and not only extend it to like celebrating De La Soul and hip-hop, as could have been the case, or as could have been seen as the case, considering a lot of the records from this sort of Legend series all kind of have that kind of vibe, but I like that they also transcend it to more just grief and loss in a way that I think sticks the landing wonderfully, which is something that I liked about Thank You For Your Service, but that kept it in a different kind of light. This very much does so in a fashion that feels very evocative of De La style, while also being an interesting look at their whole career without parts of their whole career being present. I'm not just talking Dave, obviously. I'm kind of shocked Prince Paul had nothing to do with any of this. I know that there was very much like an era post that has a lot of memorable moments and quality jams, but like, that foundation is also very important. And I think it's interesting what does end up happening from a collaborative aspect on here. I do like a lot of the parts of this sort of creative circle, so to speak, which is what this album kind of feels like at times. It feels like not just a De La album, but in some points a curated experience, which is the MO of the project, considering it opens with this like Giancarlo Esposito sort of skit intro welcoming the sort of round table of people working on this project along with the rest of De La. When it gets to the heart of just these guys writing verses with an optimistic spin and trying to look on the brighter side of things, even if there are still a frank presentation of the now, I think it just still works so potently well. I mean, obviously, it has a nice little stretch of that with You Don't Stop Through Good Health, where everybody gets their own little song, including Dave, which is a really nice treat. But even in that spirit, there's a cinematic feel to that, where in the next track, they like introduce the album proper with another skit. Like in all De La fashion, they create an album that has that kind of experience, but it's interesting to see it done so frankly about what it is. You know, that pocket of a quick 16 through really Run It Back is the most where it feels like that creative pocket working to make this sort of like record to fit the themes they want it to fit, with like Killer Mike coming in on a quick 16 from Mama. You got Jay Farrow adding to the very skit heavy atmosphere. It was great seeing Q-Tip come in on Day in the Sun, and the way that spirit feels in sort of like what it's celebrating is very much the energy that carries through the rest of the record. And I think that it culminates to a really strong project. I really dig the beats on here. I do dig a lot of the production. A lot of the sample-heavy stuff is what feels like very much a celebration of De La's, especially legacy contributions. And I like how it very much evokes the spirit of what made De La still just an interesting slice of sunshine. Even when it did get serious. I like this album a lot. I think it's really, really good. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Easily probably my favorite of this Legend series. And I'm not necessarily surprised at that, but I am glad that this did feel still very in the spirit of what makes De La work without sounding derivative or very watered down, which is what was the case on some of what I spun from this series. grinding, droning, nihilistic force. Author and Punisher dropped a new album in 2025 that I did also decide to check out on year's end. Nocturnal Birding, a record that is a bit more concise than his typical fare, if only by like a slim amount. But I feel like he really utilizes that time to hone in on striking a better use of his like just dense sonics. You know, while I liked Crueller's sort of mood, and I liked the ways that he sort of like interpreted that density into something else, I like that he sort of welcomes back that just more stern, strong, grinding presence to his heaviness that like I think pairs well with the moments where he does try to like focus on a more ambient density or like synthetic density in like in a less harsh sense. You know, he's still got his moments like real apex of Titmice where he brings in these melodies amidst the stomping groove that's kind of melting down. But like Black Storm Petrol feels like this real apex that the album sort of builds to in beautiful aggression. Like I love how Titanus sort of like plays with the heaviness and really has this like almost melding of proto-thrash ideas with his typical brain of like industrial inspired metal that I love. It's got a real like call and response to the heaviness that I absolutely adore and think he pulls off well. The way that this like weird sample that introduces Mute Swan gets brought back in once the song really sort of like comes fully together, I think is a really cool moment too. This album just has a lot of cool moments where this guy really sort of like still adapts the way he wants to get heavy with it, while also bringing back more of what I liked about him when I first got into him. I think this is a strong-ass album. I think if you like very like industrial-inspired metal and you love just absolutely nihilistic shit, Author and Punisher still brought another batch of that this year. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Quality release. I love the pacing of the record, and I think that it's truly heavy as fuck.
Pieces of flesh, bits of skull as souvenirs, new fear, out of hope, out of fate, new weight.
I'm not gonna lie, I put the Sumac and Moor Mother record, the film, on the listening log purely because one morning, sometime last month, I got Anthony talking about his favorite metal records from the year, and this ended up on there, and I was like, sure, why not? What I didn't expect was like a sludge-fueled, just drone-filled, apocalyptic record, because I don't really know Sumac like that, nor do I know Moor Mother, and I think that their collaboration here lends to a very bleak vision of the world through the lens of now. There's a lot of talk about oppression and death on a grand scale in parts of this, and there's a song like The Run, which has this throttling apocalyptic imagery throughout it that I think creates this very uneasy listening experience, and I love the push and pull with heaviness that Sumac decides to sort of add to the stage here, as far as like creating this environment that enriches that tension while letting the air give way to an uneasy atmosphere. You know, I think the first two scenes in particular really get the record off on this like groaning, harsh foot where Moor Mother really talks about, again, just like outright almost like generational death and hatred, and how it's all stemming from a systemic level. Having this rug pull of like a very big, more taking it further to an apocalyptic on scene 2 is where it has this early punctuation that I think is an interesting creative choice, considering how ambient and like very sparse the next couple tracks are. And I like how even on scene 4, there's a more toying of like juxtaposing ambience with the sludge and creating this just uneasy tension. And I love the journey that it takes the listener through, even if it is very like dystopian and bleak. And I think that if you like abstract music with a spoken word edge, I've seen some people online not really liking the spoken word energy on this album, and I can see it being disengaging with people if you don't like that vibe. But again, I talked about a Saul Williams album also earlier this month, so like I do like spoken word music, and I think that like this is a good version of that. I give this like an 8 out of 10. I don't think it's going to be my metal album of the year either, but I do think it is a really good one that'll sit amongst that rank somewhere on that list. Just I don't know if it'll be at the top.
Love that gun sound, walk a flock of flame. Rick James, bitch, I was serving Mary Jane. Yeah.
Something that I think is wild is that a buddy of mine asked if I had even spun this record when it came out, because 21 is a friend of Drake's, and Drake's even on this album. But like, one, I spun the Drake and Party Next Door record. I didn't like it that much, but I did listen to it. And I kind of like 21 Savage. I don't love all of his records. I thought his last one, American Dream, had promise but lacked some focus. But that last Savage Mode tape was sick. I even like parts of Her Loss, but not all of it. But I feel like this record definitely wants to, like, play with the listener in a way that, like, I could see be frustrating for people. The album is called What Happened to the Streets. He does have Drake and Metro on it, which is awesome and wild to see, but, like, neither really talk about it. 21 doesn't talk anything about it. While the album does sort of, like, take a break from its focus of the actual personal side of what happened to the streets, the time it does spend away from that to talk about the industry or just being gangster, it doesn't talk about some of the big shit that's been happening between the people on this record. But it, like, feels like it's trying to goat the listener to thinking that. Like, the song with Metro is called Gang Over Everything, but it gets super personal with it in a way that I like. It was just a little surprising upon first listen. But I do like that the album does really get personal with it. Like, What Happened to the Streets is not a euphemism. His problems with what's going on around him. Which, I mean, like, yeah, some of it could be a reaction to, like, hey, one of my friends that I did a whole album with is in a very prolific beef. But, like, he really narrows it down more focally. Like, on Ha, he feels like he's going after micro rappers in a way that's, like, super personal. Step Brothers has Young Nudie in it, though, and it gets, like, kind of personal and talks about, like, the other side of that coin of what happened to the streets that I think comes around on the end. But, like, that middle is full of a lot of bangers, some of which I like. That track with Glorilla is great. That track with G Herbo is alright. I don't really like either the tracks with Lotto or Drake, and I don't really like Jump Out With Your Hose. Jump Out With Your Hose is like, it feels kind of like a transitional track after like Mr. Recoup and into Dog Shit. But like, I think Mr. Recoup is like a fine song. Like, the beat is whatever. I think it is a little wild with a title like this. Drake doesn't really say anything. He teases saying something, but doesn't say anything. And that Lotto track just isn't the vibe. But like the follow through halftime interlude into I Wish, I actually think is like a really strong stretch of the record. I think that like 21 and Lil Baby talking about Atlanta and like the troubles they've been going through, I think it works well. I think that I Wish after that is a really sincere close to the record that I loved hearing. And I think that, like, that's a really good stretch of the record. And I also like the intro. So there's, like, parts of this that I enjoy. And I even like some of the dodgy middle. But it does have a middle that I think very much swerves. And I could see people liking more, but I just don't like as much. And I think that, like, as far as being a pretty solid A to B, it is that. Do I think it could have been a little better? Sure. But I think that, like, 21, fitting the vibe, hitting the theme, getting personal with it, I dig it. And I dig the instrumental palette for a lot of it, too. I think it's a pretty solid record. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10. It's really not that bad. I feel like 21's also, like, evolving his artistry and his flow more. He's really just getting into the weeds of rapping, and I dig seeing it.
Here's my galactic citizenship card. Interplanetary mission, I've been discharged to hit y'all. No ancillary staff will...
The last of this Legend series that came out in hip-hop this year that I listened to, the Nas and DJ Premier album, Light Years. The album that I figured was going to be alright. I had, like, the least fear or caution, partially because Nas just did a 6-peat with Hit Boy, and it was great. The only thing I figured that this album wasn't going to be was as good as those. And I figured it was because the album's going to more feel like his Life is Good record. His record that, like, very much gets nostalgic in a personal way, but like more fit in the vibe of where pockets of this Legends series have gone as far as like reflection and sonic palette and, you know, sample choice that fits the vibe. And I think it does better than some of the other ones that I've reviewed this year that I didn't really like that much. But I think that like this is a solid, another, you know, alley-oop in Nas's career. You know, it very much gets personal and very direct homages. Like there's a sequel to New York State of Mind on here. I think it's wild hearing that song become a trilogy now, but it's a neat vibe. It's not, the beat's not the same. It's an inversion. It's an interesting sort of like tangent while also reflecting on being both a New York rapper for so long and the song itself. It's an interesting slice and example of like the archetype and vibe this album is fitting, because it does fit the like reflective lens that Nas has done in the King's Disease records, but like it's got that different feel. Like Writers, a song that like is a look back on graffiti tagging, something else that DJ Premier has been linked to production wise, because he did that song with Macklemore on his record that was also about graffiti taggers that he did the production on. But like this track, but Writers is a really cool jam that has some cool samples to tie the hook together. I really love that use of the Far Side sample. You guys know I love Bizarre Ride to the Far Side, and I think that that's a really cool little flip for that, a little slide in that. He also gets reflective and sort of like nostalgic on Nasty Escobar Nazir, a song where he raps about the alter ego and the drug slinging and the killing and all that stuff as Nasty Escobar Nazir. And I think that it's a really cool late in the album cut that gets reflective and nostalgic in a way that I think works. I think it's interesting that he decides to give different parts of this record to pay tribute and to inspire. Similarly to Life is Good, like on Sons, Young Kings, a song about inspiring young men to be better, while also giving a song for women, Bouquet to the Ladies. Pays tribute to women and talks about how much he respects what they do. I also think it's interesting that Premier gets to wax nostalgic. The production choices feel very like indebted to the Premier style of production, but like the Pause Tapes interlude I think is a cool little nugget of talking about just waxing nostalgic on the production side of things. I love that they included that in this, because like I like that like there is very much a love for the production side that's gone throughout this Legend series, but this record really showcases that, along with having Nas just wax nostalgic. And I think that his waxing nostalgic is fun and it's solid. Do I think it's as good or interesting as what he was doing on the Magic series in particular? Not necessarily, but I do think that this is a strong slice in his discography nonetheless. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10. It's a really solid record in Nas's career. I liked seeing these two come together, and I think that it's very much like, it's good.
I took a hit of the ghost weed and said, I'll go get a slice of pizza instead. I took my time and put my mind into my books of...
After what was an unprecedented, like, prolific stretch that kind of permeated throughout the 2010s and a little bit into the 2020s, Atmosphere taking a couple years off, I think was a pretty solid move. Not that I think they were starting to get sort of, like, ran dry on ideas. I think Word and so many other realities exist simultaneously. Were interesting practices in making a loose but still like focused project. But what I like about Jestures is that it just kind of keeps its shtick, its theme in the listener's mind while taking the time to sort of like just do other things and make an album of a different spirit. And I think that creates a little more life for Slug and Ant on here. There are some interesting homages to Atmosphere's past throughout a lot of this, and there's some points of reflection, like on Jester or on Sean, where he literally just kind of waxes poetic about his name, but also like on Triple X. But like what I like about this is that a lot of this record, not all of it, but a lot of it keeps this very like direct focus with these like one title or one word song titles, where in some cases that becomes like a focus in a wordplay sort of way. That doesn't really happen on Sean. His name is just kind of the focus and he waxes on that. But like Grateful becomes this like mantra of that song. Asshole and Baby kind of have plays on the use of baby and asshole to kind of create interesting verses and dialogue with Sean and somebody else that he's directing his verses at to a really good effect. Instrument is an instrumental song. Like, it's very much an album that tries to be coy and fun in ways that, like, Atmosphere, I don't necessarily think lost on their pilgrimage of these records that were, like, focused on a mood or a sonic template or a direct vibe. But I like that this sort of feels like, similarly to parts of Word, a sort of just, like, modern iteration of, like, what Atmosphere were kind of doing in their roots. But this album having a more reflective twist gives it that kind of like legacy act feel that I think Atmosphere wears well, and I think Slug has been trying to like really adorn with his bar spinning with grace. And I like this album. I think that it's a really solid record. I think that a lot of the collaborations coalesce together well. I like Evidence on Effortless. I love the Posse Cut Mash. I think that song is a lot of fun. I also think Zoodville very much matches the mood and vibe of Zorro and it helps close the album out strongly. Yeah, this album's just solid. This is a solid-ass record from these guys that I think doesn't overstay its welcome, but I think some could find that the case. I think I felt that way initially, but the more that I sat with it, the more I kind of just really enjoyed the vibes.
It wasn't until the editing bay that it literally just clicked with me that it's the alphabet. I'd looked at this track listing. I'd wondered, why is it so many tracks? And like that ties so well into the themes, the reflections, the fatherhood stuff. This album's great. It's an 8 out of fucking 10 at least.
Past life. Sometimes it feels like life's a distant memory of that night.
You know, to some degree, I always felt it's a little unpredictable to gauge where Kid Cudi is really going to focus his career on next. Between his dives in and out of acting, his dives in and out of other genres, and the resurgence of him discussing the idea of taking a break from music altogether, any release he decides to drop always sort of feels like a surprise. That's sort of what made the Insano duology, his last release before this, all the more out there, considering it was amidst all those taking great talks. But Free sees him embracing a different type of freedom. Not the freedom of pressure to do something and just going insane with it. The freedom to just make a record that wants to live in the barest sense outside of the realm strictly of hip-hop and or rock, and more sit in a general pop world. But in that general pop ambiguity, while there are components that feel very Kid Cudi, they stick out and feel almost like a crutch with which Kid Cudi leans on, which is almost a disservice to some of the stylistic ideas on here, because I don't think Kid Cudi wears the pop crown all that badly on parts of this. You know, I really love the duology of Truman Show into Submarine. I think that they are a pairing that works well together. The writing on Truman Show, I think, is strong, and it's a nice tune, and I like the production on that song. I also think Submarine after that creates a nice wash-in to a different type of groove that still fits, you know, Kid Cudi well. I think that some of the hook writing on here isn't too bad either. I think Grave has a bit of a wordy hook, but it's still catchy in how it plays with the leads that get played in on the acoustic that gets turned into a bit more of a contemporary jam. I like parts of this. I think there's some components that I think work. I think the album gets off on a bit of a rough foot. You know, I don't think that Neverland or Mr. Miracle are amongst my favorites. I think the vibe of Mr. Miracle is an interesting avenue and a sonic palette that I think Cudi works decently, but I don't think the song is the strongest hook-driven song. But I don't think there's any lows on this that match some of the lows that crop up on especially the first Insano. And as far as Kid Cudi wanting to more focus on the foundations of hook-driven music, this is a direction that I think he tackles amicably, if not a bit too basic in some of the executions. But like the emotion on Deep Diving sticks out in the starkness pretty decently. You know, I think Past Life is the drowsy, almost hum-adjacent sound that Kid Cudi has embraced to almost a meme-like status sometimes, translated into a solid pop song. You know, there's parts of this that I think are alright, just not all of it. But I am going to give this a 6 out of 10, because it is a very solid pop album from Kid Cudi that I wouldn't be against seeing him really experiment with and write different types of pop songs.
Even the stop clock is right. Twice every day.
There were a few older, ironically enough, thrash bands that came back in 2025, and again, only one of the crop was one that I did end up getting to by the year's end, but it was Coroner's Dissonance Theory, and it's partially because I had seen a lot of praise thrown towards the album, and I'm not really a Coroner guy. One of the bands that did drop an album that I didn't check out was Testament. I heard their new album's pretty solid, but I've seen this album getting a lot of praise, and I think it is very much apt. It is a really strong outing, and I dig how this band came back and had something to say, and I like how they say it. You know, it's an album about how man is sort of playing Frankenstein with AI and the real problems that could arise with that. It's a tale as old as time at this point in the grand scheme of things, but like I think that when done well, it can still shine, and I enjoy how they steep this story in their solo-filled, euphoric, thrashy madness. I love the production of this album. It's very, like, straight and narrow and tight, and I love how, I like just vintage and iconic it sounds. The balance of, like, drive and just blinding solo work is great. The groove play on here is really fun. They let those, like, technical-ass elements shine. You know, I love the syncopation play on Consequence and Transparent Eye. You know, ironically enough, one thing that I think the Sonics do remind me of, especially when they get euphoric, like on Sacrificial Lamb, there's a moment where there's just this, like, choral breakdown, and it just makes me ascend every time. But I think that the balance that the band strikes with all of these elements while telling this story of man finally crossing that threshold with the use of AI and the ensuing destruction as the back half of the album just feels like this ongoing stretch of just dread and horror, but like in a very well-constructed manner. I really enjoy this record. I think that it is a strong outing. I don't think it's my like favorite metal album I've spun this year, but I would rank it like in my top 5, maybe even my top 3. It is really that good. I think that, like, if I had caught the wave, when did this come out? This came out in October. So, I mean, like, it was a late in the year release on its own, but, like, I think that it does really fucking strike a chord strongly, and I think gives its message a lot of weight and brevity with, honestly, just a sound that I think sounds well harnessed. They don't sound like they've aged a day, even though it's their first album in fucking forever. For a comeback record, this is fantastic as hell. It makes me want to get into their older work, because even though I grew up like an 80s thrash fan, like, Coroner were not a band that I ever really checked out, but if they sound like this and their older stuff, I'll definitely eat this the fuck up. I've been talking a lot of hype of metal in this video, but like, it was a really strong year for the genre, even if prior to this point it had very few highs on this channel. Diving into what the genre really had going on this year, I feel like I definitely missed out on some highs, but Coroner's Dissonance Theory is one that I think definitely stands up there as like a really strong release from this year. I love its use of theme a lot, honestly. I think it's just a really strong metal album that feels like very still technical, but like technically back to basics in the best way possible. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. It's a very, very strong album, and I can't recommend it enough if you like a very traditional thrash sound done just very well. Another in the worlds of checking out something based on the hype, Wednesday's new album, Bleeds, is my first excursion with this North Carolinian band, and I really dig their sounds as somebody whose sonic blueprint with which their taste sprouted from in the like the truest core emanates on this. And as somebody who grew up on that shit, it's cool to see bands interpolate in a modern sense. I dig the guitar production on this a hell of a lot. I dig the attitude with which the album leans with songwriting wise, and I think that the I think that the cocktail of grunge and twang-inspired rock that was very much a thing in pockets of the mid-early 90s really builds and ruminates into a cool sonic palette that I think this band writes some really good songs with. There's a sort of slice-of-lifeness to it as well that lends to the very everyman style that style of rock emanated in the 90s too, but done in a modern sense that I like, with some of the writing on the opener, Reality TV Argument Bleeds. I think that world gets brought even more to its core roots on tracks like Townies and Elderberry Wine. I dig the explosion on Pick Up the Knife. It adds to the drama of the song. There's a noise that they carry on a song like that I think adds to the dreariness on Carolina Murder Suicide just as potently. The moments where they, again, detour into softer realms like The Way Love Goes, I think stick the landing just as strongly too. This is a really good record. I'm pissed at myself for putting off spinning this album earlier and really drinking the tea, so to speak. I think that this is a really cool batch of ideas that lend to the strengths that this band is already swinging with just really well. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. This is a choice-ass record.
And it plays every motherfucking block I beat. In it with a zones. Heard this road on stone. What's a car with I?
Big KRIT doing a tribute to just rolling around in a car that you miss is very much something that I could imagine him doing, even if it has been used as a vehicle for different themes. I think it's interesting that KRIT tries to establish a concept that is ripe with that kind of creative potential, even from his sort of like desire to have the common man's POV, but chooses, especially in some choice pockets, to just spit in the face of that entirely to create a record that really just tries to go hard on vibes. And I don't necessarily think that those vibes are going to carry with the same longevity that I feel like has worked for him in the past on records like KRIT Is Here, a record that did see him hopping on other people's production to set a vibe, to talk about energy, to talk about just creating a stage, but while also having some slices and moments with his roots as a rapper and his sort of core identity as a rapper that I think had more legs than I even thought may have been the case when I first reviewed it. But I don't think that'll be the case here, because one, I don't think the production is nearly as good. I think that there's some choice production here, and I like that KRIT is still trying to mix it up with throwing in some love with other producers in the area, even if I do think he is still a guy with a good, hand of beat-making skills on his own. That said, I do think there are some songs that I do think strike a solid balance and create a decent vibe, so to speak. Like Gotta Do It. I think that that's a really lean, hook-driven song that I think, as far as like being a motivational song, succeeds in doing so. The laid-back funk on High Def is also a really nice early in the album cut that I think works pretty well. And yeah, I do like the posse cut that closes this album off. But I wish there was more energy like that sprinkled throughout parts of the record. I like the laid-back groove of So Far So Good, but that's a track that feels like it needs a little more to it. I think the same could be said for another one of the songs being pushed as a single, I-20. I think that they have solid instrumentals, and I think KRIT does a decent job at like just setting a vibe, but it feels like the vibe is missing just a little je ne sais quoi, so to speak. Plus, I really don't enjoy some of the other tangents the album goes on, like Not on the Whip, a song that tries to take a neutral non-stance on confrontation of any kind, even if there's some parts of the skit in the intro that set up trying to like address certain aspects happening in the world. I also think that some of the skits, while very bountiful, don't really lead to a whole lot in some instances. I don't know. It feels like an album that feels like it's trying to pad itself out while also not coming to the table with a whole lot to begin with, which is kind of unfortunate considering I was not that into KRIT's last album that was trying to have this concept that very much also felt kind of undercooked. That said, I think I like this maybe a little more than that because its concept isn't trying to be as bold as the concept to Digital Roses Don't Die. I think I'm giving it the same score, though. I'm giving it a 5 because I don't think it has enough to elevate it to a record that I would say, a level that I would say I would seek out spinning it as a whole. But I do think there are some songs on here that are really, really fucking choice and show that KRIT still has some chops as a solid hit maker and still has some great flow and decent everyman things to say, even if he is still trying to like branch out in realms that are a little too neutral, maybe.
I only knew what to expect with about half of this Chat Pile Hayden Pedigo record, In the Earth Again. An album that I was excited for upon release because Chat Pile have been on an insane run. Both their records, I think, are incredible. I thought Cool World was one of the best albums of its year, like from a higher caliber than God's Country, but both were in their respective top 50s. This album, spoilers, is also in my broader top 50. It's just a little lower, and it's partially because I don't necessarily hate the combination of some of the mellower ideas here. I think that Hayden presents a good juxtaposition and a more honestly human nature to what has been like a very extreme or intense band that has been Chat Pile. And that intensity really does show in glorious splendor. And I love when it does. And I also love when Hayden does. It's just a love of two different flavors that pair well together, but aren't my favorite pairing together, if that makes sense. And to be frank, I don't necessarily blame that wholly on one respective piece or the other. I think everybody here is doing great. I mean, Never Say Die is like some iconic, just pump, like, marching, stomping riffage. Fission Fusion is just absolute madness. And the Matador has this really apocalyptic feel amidst its mood. The whole stretch after Fission Fusion feels like a sort of, like, trail off. Because, like, Fission Fusion is a pretty intense song in comparison to a lot of the record. Like, you know, it starts with Outside and flows really, like, theatrically through Demon Time. It's a song that really, like, sets a stage. And I think really does give a mood that I enjoy. And I like that it just gives way to Never Say Die, where it's like, hey, Chat Pile's here. And it's a really cool pairing. And it's a really cool, like, listen, it gets a really cool sort of experience. You know, not to say that, like, Chat Pile is one vibe, especially throughout Cool World, but, like, it is a different kind of vibe. And it's a cool journey that it takes you through. The Magic of the World is a transcendental moment of beauty that I absolutely love. And it's wild that it's like sandwiched between what it's sandwiched between. It's a neat pairing. It's just a wild pairing. And I think that it is like, again, it's a pairing of sounds that I like, but I wouldn't say I necessarily love either sound together more than I would maybe apart. I compare this kind of to a less intense degree, as far as like the pairing together being extreme, to the Venetian Snares Daniel Lanois album from like 2019. Because like Venetian Snares is like a very intense like breakcore artist. He does do like mellower stuff, but like he's very much known for crazy drum work, drum production, and or like just electronic drums. And I didn't know Daniel Lanois. And he was kind of an ambient guitarist. I'm getting sidetracked. This record is very good. It's just not my favorite thing Chat pile is done. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. I think my metal list comes out in a couple days. It is on there, spoilers. But again, it's not my metal album of the year. Thank you for watching that. Thank you for watching this. If you're watching the outro, if you didn't like it, give it a like. You're watching this. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week. Typically, I've been airing on the side of 2 to 3, rarely 1, and sometimes 4. And next week is going to be like 5, because we got list week, and basketball is a train that keeps rolling, because there's a lot of games of basketball. And we got to see where we go with the Denver Nuggets, baby. And then Saturdays, I'm trying to finagle blueprints into one finale next week. And then we'll do something new on Saturdays to stand in the shadow of basketball. Because basketball is like my anime. And I'm excited to play. Got more music stuff in January and other niche 2025 things on the horizons. I'm going to stop rambling. This video was long enough, and I'm sure you guys, if you want to watch the end, want it to end. So thank you for watching. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I will see you another day.
For me.